views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening. Welcome to BronxTalk. There's a lot going on in our streets. You could trace it to Black Lives Matter, and then we understand we're recording today on a Friday. There's a Blue Lives Matter march going on in the Bronx today. So you have two sides of the street occupied by two different groups who essentially want the same thing. They want peace in our streets, and they want our police officers to have the opportunity to do their jobs and do their jobs effectively without infringing on the rights of certainly people of color or anybody in the borough of the Bronx. So that's how we're going to get the program started this evening. We've got great guests, and we're going to examine each one of them. Let's start off with the council member from the 16th Council District in the South Bronx. She's the former chair of the City Council's Public Safety Committee and is very involved in all of these issues. Welcome to Council Member Vanessa Gibson.
Thank you, Gary. You too.
Great, nice to have you. Also, we have the NYPD clergy liaison for the 48th precinct. He's a sergeant of arms with the community council, also the pastor of Flow Kingdom Ministries. Welcome to Pastor Louie Negron. Nice to have you with us, Pastor.
Blessings, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And also a staff member for Stave Our Street. She's been with them for 6 years. They've been in business for 7 years, trying to keep things calm in the streets of the Bronx. And so it's our pleasure to welcome Marisol Rivera to the program. Nice to have you with us, Ms. Rivera.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Council member, let's start with you. I laid out a lot of what is going on. Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. You were quoted in the Times, I think very clearly, as offering a moderated, maybe sensible point of view. And that sensible point of view says, hey, wait a minute. When something happens, we call the police. We need the police. We want the police. We don't want to make enemies of the police. How do we bring everybody together?
Right. So thank you, Gary, for having me on. And it's good to see you, Pastor and Marisol. This is a constant evolving conversation on how we define public safety across the city, but really across America. We've struggled as a country. There is so much violence going on in the world, and we are always looking at creative and innovative ways in which we can address gun violence. So first, we believe that gun violence is a health crisis. We attack it from a holistic perspective. We look at gun violence as a way to address the underlying conditions in our community, like poverty, like underemployment, like lack of jobs and mentoring programs for young people. And we try to identify why youth engage in violence in the first place, why it's so easy to get a gun, but equally as important, why are young people so easily willing to use a gun? The value of life these days, right? Loving your brother and your sister and your neighbor. It hasn't been easy. This has been a trying time for us this summer. We've seen violence through the roof. We've seen the same neighborhoods struggle with gun violence and shootings and homicides, but these are the same communities that we've also struggled with in many other areas like poverty and underemployment as well. And so the question is, how do we get everyone together? How do we find a balance? How do we bring NYPD to the table? Cure violence, anti-gun violence advocates, clergy, faith-based leaders, community partners, elected officials, everyday residents. We all have to have a responsibility because mothers are burying their children like never before, and it's not normal.
Talk to me, and this certainly is going to relate to the other two guests. Talk to me about how people in the Black Lives Matter movement feel about the police force. And then I know you know many police officers and people in police administration. How do they feel about the fact that they're being targeted? And listen, we all know that most police officers really do a good job, and we're thankful for their work. What's the relationship like? And then, of course, how do we address that relationship?
Right. The relationship over the years has obviously been strained. When years ago we had stop, question, frisk, we had a high number of young Black and brown men and women of color that were being arrested fraudulently. They were not convicted of any of these charges they were accused of. So we've come a long way as a city of New York. We've seen crime at the highest levels, thousands of homicides every year, to coming down to the Bronx and the city of New York, breaking our end of year records with, 300 homicides. Even though that's still a high number, anything over zero, we should always strive to do better. But we've seen a lot of improvements. Residents have stepped up. They have worked with law enforcement. We've looked at new approaches like neighborhood coordination officer. We've instituted community-based policing. We've implemented a lot of legislation, changing the behavior of the department. We know the majority of officers put their life on the line every day. They don't wake up saying, I want to choke a Black man, or I want to use excessive force on a man or woman of color. They don't wake up with that mindset, but we know we have those that think racist in all facets of life, right? Systemic racism has been around for 401 years in this country. This is nothing new. I think why you're hearing a lot of the advocacy now around Black Lives Matter and reaffirming that a Black life should always matter, just as every other life has always mattered, is because of the horrific murder in May of George Floyd in Minneapolis. When people saw this man gasp for air, cry out for his mother for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It is alarming because he's a Black man, and we've seen far too many Black men victims of police violence in this country. So that's where we are. And since that time, we've seen budget adoptions that cut the department. We've seen violence. We've seen marches and demonstrations, but people are really upset and they want change, and they want change now.
I'm going to just address very quickly the first thing that you said during that moment, and that is we need somebody to bring everybody together. I think there's been a failure of leadership, frankly, at the borough level, at the city hall level, and certainly the president has set the wrong tone, so that we will have Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter on two sides of the street when in fact, they both really need each other. So that leads us right to Pastor Louie Negron. Pastor Negron, what's the dialogue like in the community councils? And I know that you work with the 4-8 directly, but you work with other precincts. What do you hear from the Blue Lives, from the people wearing the uniform and the people that we entrust our police force to?
Again, thanks for having me. I'll be honest with you. When the incident with George Floyd took place, I got a lot of phone calls from officers. Many of them were in tears. They were hurt from what they saw. They were really disturbed by what they saw. And then in the pending days afterwards, because we're in the largest city in the world with the largest police department in the country, right away, things begin to be a sort of narrative of the NYPD so along the same lines. And many of the officers that I work with at the 48 precinct, you'd be surprised. Many of them are from our neighborhood. They're Black, Afro-Latino. They're from our neighborhood. They grew up in our neighborhoods. They went to our local schools, which is much different than 10 years ago. So they said, man, this is, I'm hurt by what happened. And, they felt very strongly that it was wrong.
So how do we communicate that to people? And that's going to lead us right to Marisol Rivera in a moment. But how do we communicate that fact that you said that many of the police officers, actually understand what's going on and on many levels feel part of it, to people who, when I read it on social media all the time, when we talk about moderating, in fact, when there was a Save Our Streets march, and I saw people commenting, it's all baloney because they don't care about us and all that. There's no connection. That, of course, gets back to the leadership question. But from your perspective, what do we do here?
So right before COVID hit, at the end of February, I did an award ceremony at our church. Our church is the Flow Kingdom Ministries with Dr. Israel Pena. He's a senior pastor. And we did an award ceremony rewarding a lot of the police officers and many from the borough that are doing a great job. So we're sort of bridging the gap for our communities in that capacity. There was a listening tour that Chief Pichardo had done. And the listening tour, he went around to all the precincts throughout the city and said, what do you guys want? and everyone said the same thing. Everyone wanted more NCO officers. Everyone wanted more neighborhood coordination officers. At the same time, there was a structure to release a new program called YCO, which is a youth coordination officer. This is pre-COVID. When COVID hit, it stopped the YCO program from launching. So the department was already moving on a sort of neighborhood policing sort of tool that was being really resourceful. I think we have to get back to that, and that's what's happening now. Really get back to the police officers on the basketball courts, playing with the kids, being at the food pantries, helping out in that capacity. And when enforcement needs to take place, that can take place, but you know the people you're policing.
Can that happen if we have Black Lives Matter on one side of the street and Blue Lives Matter on the other side of the street? Can that happen? I mean, I'm agreeing with you, but the reality is what I see outside right now, and the dialogue I see on Bronx social media and in the national social media, is that, 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. They don't mix.
Yeah, unfortunately, Gary, I think the louder voices seem to prevail, but it's not always the case. The louder voices are simply the louder voices. The working citizens, the people who love the Bronx, they're not the loud voices. They're not the ones on social media. They're not the ones that are protesting in the streets. If you ask day-to-day citizens of the Bronx, what do you want? They say, we want police in our neighborhood, and I want our police department working with our elected officials, like the great job that Vanessa's doing. They want to work with the cure violence organizations. They want to work with the clergy. So I believe if we get these three sections together, if clergy comes together with elected officials and other community organizations with the police department, we can make a difference.
Before Marisol Rivera jumps out of her seat, because I know she has a lot to say about this, I don't even know if I'm going to ask you a question. You heard a lot of things here, and I'm sure every one of those things you heard relates to something that you work on. So talk about Save Our Streets, what place you and your organization has in what I call the cauldron of difficult communication.
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Marisol Rivera. I represent Save Our Streets Bronx, which is a community-based organization that works with high-risk kids from 16 to 24. And we just basically want to give them resources and let them know we're here for them. Everybody needs help. We work in one of the poorest places, just like Pastor Louie said, where there's lack of knowledge, lack of resources. So we definitely on the ground every day trying to intervene and trying to mediate situations. But, sometimes that's not always successful, but we do the best that we can,
Has the current climate that we've defined here of neighborhood people, Black Lives Matter, and people who support the police as if that's not part of the agenda of the community, has that interfered with your ability to really bring people together and get everybody to understand what the council member said about systemic racism, about issues that create gun violence and all those kinds of things? Has this climate made it more difficult?
I wouldn't say the climate made it difficult to serve the people, because that's what we're about, just to serve the people in the community. But it's once the COVID hit and everything, I feel like it even traumatized the community people and the neighborhood people even more. So that's why we out there on the ground giving out hand sanitizers. We giving out PPEs just to keep the community safe and support them where they really need it at this time, because it's hard for everyone.
Council member, what we've been talking about. We're trying to mediate the thing right here. What role does Save Our Streets and the work that Pastor Louie does? What role do they have in this? Can it be an effective role to get people on the same page? And then the next question is something I want to ask you, which we talked about last month, and that is about the budget consideration.
Okay.
So let's start with these organizations.
Yep. Our anti-gun violence organizations and our clergy play a crucial role. They're all credible messengers. They have an audience, they have a trust, they have a compassion, and they have a level of consistency and continuity in our communities. And that's exactly what young people need. They need to feel hope. They need to feel that there is an opportunity to do better. They need to believe that they are success stories and not a product of the neighborhood. They need to feel that they have options. And a lot of our young people will tell you the streets is their family. They feel like there's a war going on outside and nobody cares. So number one, we have to show them we care. We have to show them we love them, because they're not seeing love from anywhere, not in their neighborhood, sometimes not their household, not from family members. They get love from the streets. And that's not the type of love we want our young people to see. That is the challenge. I appreciate Pastor mentioning this, and this is really important to highlight. Sometimes the loudest voices that you see in the media and on the streets demonstrating do not represent all people. And that has been the problem. The everyday resident, the homeowner, the small business resident, the mom, dad that goes to work every day, they are not out there protesting because they have to take care of their families. They want to see police on our streets. They want to see a presence. I think for many of our residents, for many years, they equate public safety with the presence of police officers. And we understand that. Now we're introducing them to the anti-gun violence world of cure violence, of hospital responders, of mediators, and it's a new concept. I really believe when you look at policing, school safety, law enforcement in general, we have to redefine what public safety means and policing overall, because it's not just law enforcement. It is the residents and everyone else that is a part of this conversation and solution.
So this leads us right into the budget question, and we did a full show on that. I guess I'm sure you remember a little more than a month ago. Defund the police. They cut out a sixth of the $6 billion budget, although as we understand it's been reapportioned, so it wasn't really a full cut. My contention has been for this period of time, you should take that money and then fund it into organizations like Save Our Streets or all of our community centers. I was at the Bronx River Community Center the other day. It was one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen before. Marshall Montague Community Center. I believe this would feed into what Ms. Rivera was talking about, and certainly what Pastor Louie is talking about. Is that reality in the city council? Certainly not right now, it didn't happen, but is that the way to go for the future?
Absolutely. I think this budget, unlike all the others, has been the most challenging in my 7 years in the council. We had a $9 billion budget deficit. We lost $7 billion in revenue due to COVID, and the state adopted budget cut us by $2 billion, and we had no federal dollars. So the adopted budget that we passed last month only included cuts, serious cuts to agencies all across the board, including sanitation and parks, as you guys all see in your community, as well as reserves that we have been able to save over the years. Without federal support, without the ability to borrow, we had to make some painful decisions. But we also wanted to protect jobs. We wanted to protect safety net programs. So the shift of $1 billion in expense of the NYPD, some may believe, but it's really not the case. It wasn't a blank check for $1 billion. It's not an exact transfer because the budget has to be adopted at the end of the day. So a lot of that money went into the summer youth pot of $115 million of Beacon, Compass, Sonic, Cornerstone, Summer Camp, opening the parks, the pools, trying to save CUNY ASAP, the Single Shepherd Social Workers Program, Fair Student Funding, Fair Futures. A lot of those programs the administration wanted to decimate, and we couldn't let that happen. Foster youth, LGBT youth, children, seniors. So we saved a lot of programs, but a lot of agencies were heavily cut. And so right now, where we stand is we need federal support in the CARES Act, the stimulus package, or we need the ability to borrow from Albany, or October 1st, 22,000 city workers are going to be laid off, and we all know they will start at the bottom, and that means the low-wage African-American, Latino, and Asian city workers that have been working during this pandemic, and we cannot let that happen.
And I think the important conclusion out of what you say is that these are not separate issues from the fact that gun violence has spiked throughout the city of New York. You established it earlier. I certainly agree. Pastor Louie, I want to just bring up something that's really interesting and just happened. Through the lawsuit and through the recent legislation, 323,000 complaints about police officers were released. Those have been gathered since 1985. A lot has been made. of the fact that the class 2 police commissioners had complaints about them in the past. Of course, complaints don't mean, confirmed actions and confirmed activities. They are something to look at. And in fact, we interviewed a police officer a retired police officer on this program who said, every time I made a collar, every time I made an arrest, I got a complaint about me because, they said, hey, it was his fault. It wasn't my fault. When the police officers you work with see something like that, don't they have a right to say, hey, wait a minute, this is kind of out of control. Maybe somebody complained about me, but I'm a good cop. I never did any, I've done my job. I've worked hard. I've dealt with the biggest problems. What's your thoughts about that? And what do you hear and feel from other police officers?
Well, it's interesting because when you see a video like a mother being tackled down to the ground in a train station with her 3-year-old child because she didn't have a mask on, or a gentleman being smacked in the face and thrown down to the ground by a police officer, or in Rockaways, a young man being put in a chokehold after George Floyd, you say, man, something's wrong. We live in a world of digital media. Everything is social. Within minutes, things are released. Everyone can see everything and a lot more.
Let me just interject that the recent legislation from the state paved the way that said you are allowed, which is a subliminal way of saying you're encouraged to videotape whatever you see. And, then obviously, you get a record out of that. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I mean, a record of what had happened. But I wanted to bring that up. It's not just at random, and it's not just you saying this is the trend. This is a legislative right now ordained by the state of New York. Go ahead.
It's in all things, with crime, whether police misconduct. It's something where within minutes it's viral, hundreds of thousands of views. And when you speak to police officers, at least myself, when I speak to police officers, and I make it my business to do roll calls on a regular basis to sort of remind the police officers that they're walking into our communities, they're starting their day with prayer, they're being reminded of the sense of community. And when I told them, hey, did you see that video with the young lady being thrown down to the ground? They say, man, that was disgusting. I would never do something like that. That's crazy. Right. Yeah, I don't agree with that. Officers would say they don't agree with some of those tactics, and even enforcing face masks. It's not really a police issue to enforce face masks, and I'm glad they pulled that away because most of the police officers understand people can't afford face masks, and things are difficult out there.
Yeah, well, this gets into a whole other thing, which is also budgetary, and that is asking police officers to do work like dealing with people who've overdosed and other issues that we've been asking them to do. And really, if we're putting money into that, we really should find other ways of handling that. Let me ask you something else, and then we're going to go to Ms. Rivera. When the police officers see a video of a police officer being run over in the street at a Black Lives Matter protest, I think they would say that's pretty disgusting also. And to me, that video fuels what I said earlier, the two sides of the street.
Again, many of the officers now, when I was growing up and I hung out, I'm from Webster Avenue in the Bronx, right? I hung out in the neighborhood. The police that were policing then versus the police that are policing now are two different. The police that are policing now, many of them look just like me. They're Hispanic, they're Black, they come from my neighborhood, they know our lingo. So when I see things like that happen, it breaks my heart. And I've had friends of mine who are on the force and say, hey, last night I got shot at 3-4 times on Fordham Road, during a riot. I'm getting shot. I got a brick thrown at my head. And that's not necessarily, it's not right. And to say that, the police deserve that, or to say that the police department will look at it and say, oh, okay, we're at war with the community. Many of them just say, hey, I was out there trying to protect people's lives and I got shot at. Right.
And
I got shot at.
Yeah.
And I'm from that neighborhood.
I'm completely sympathetic to that. I understand exactly what you're saying. Ms. Rivera, when you and your organization talks to community people who express this kind of upsetness, how do you deal with it? What do you say to them about saying, well, wait a minute, if you behave X, this is what's going to happen? And how do you get people to change their behaviors so that we do save our streets, so to speak?
Well, definitely bridging the gap is definitely important, and we've been definitely working on that, and that been getting better. So we've been meeting with, our local precincts, just trying to get the officers to know the cure violence sites and to know exactly what it is they do. So when we on the street, you know, they got their lane, they got their job to do, and we got our job to do. So if we could intervene before a kid could get locked up, that's really the goal and the objective, because it takes a village and it takes all of us together to come together for this to stop.
Does the police precinct or precincts that you work with, do they accept that kind of conversation? I mean, are they
Absolutely.
Do?
You know, we've been there for 6 years, so I'm not going to say at the beginning it wasn't easy, because if they don't know who we are, you know, it's so. But now that we've had conversations, we've been having meetings, we definitely bridging the gap so it could be stronger and we could serve the people and we could save these streets.
Among the things that I have learned from this, and I thought it was, and all three of you have echoed it, is maybe the loudest voices that we're hearing are not the bottom line, and that the people that Pastor Negron and the Ms. Rivera and even the council member deal with are people who say, wait a minute, we want to work together. I'm very hopeful for that. People, you can check out Save Our Streets online. So we thank Ms. Rivera for joining us. Council member, I thought, you know, we could really talk about this for a very long time. Very interesting that the mayor of the city of New York let the health commissioner go, whereas Dermot Shea came out very directly against the mayor himself and some of the policies. Dermot Shea said to a you know, a police action at a rally in the South Bronx, it was done perfectly. I saw the videos. I mean, I realize it's just a video, and I talked to a lot of people. It didn't go perfectly. Maybe just a comment on how the leadership of the police department might kind of help rather than create more problems. We got about a minute, and then a minute for Pastor Negron.
Okay, I think it's been pretty interesting since we passed the budget and we've had a series of demonstrations around Black Lives Matter across the city. I've not really appreciated some of the language I've heard from the leadership of the NYPD, because it almost seems that everyone is to blame for the crime except the NYPD. The DA, the elected officials, we're all to blame, and we all have to take responsibility. And I think leadership is key at this time. There seems to be an issue in the administration.
I gotta cut you off because we're just about out of time.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. Clearly, this dialogue is going to continue, and clearly, we're going to revisit it again. Pastor Negron, what's next for you? I know you're working on faith-based leadership in this area. So give me about 20 seconds about what you're working on next.
First and foremost, want to work hard to activate every church in the Bronx to start taking over their communities, and also making sure that they're working with the elected officials and each individual precinct throughout the Bronx, including this Saturday, we're having a huge back-to-school event, barbecue, working with the police department, working with our neighborhoods to bless our communities and try to get our young youth ready for employment.
Thank you very much. We're going to thank everybody for joining us. Very important show. The dialogue will continue here on BronxNet, and certainly we'll bring it back to BronxTalk. Marisol Rivera, Save Our Streets. That's what we want to do. Thank you so much for saving our streets. Pastor Louie Negron, thank you. Councilmember Vanessa Gibson, thank you. One very quick announcement. Our producer, Helen Greenberg, this is her last program with us. We'll make the announcement. Some people don't know. She is going to be the press secretary for Borough President in June. So she will be leaving BronxNet after many, many years of working here. We thank her for her great work. Our new producer is Stephen Powell. He'll be with us next week. And you'll be with us too. We'll talk about this, that, or the other. We're probably going to talk about actually jobs, getting people jobs, getting vocational training jobs next week. See you all. Good night.